I'm Cassie, and exactly 48 hours ago, I held my 1-year-old son Nathan in a hospital bed while doctors pumped his tiny stomach. The woman who caused it? My sister Victoria, who smiled sweetly as she fed him homemade baby food that she knew would destroy him. But what Victoria didn't know was that my husband Jake isn't just any father protecting his child. He's a Delta Force commander with 12 years of tactical experience, and when someone threatens his family, he doesn't just get even, he gets systematic. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning of Nathan's first birthday started like something from a magazine. I'd spent 3 weeks planning every detail, from the handmade woodland creature decorations to the organic carrot cake I'd baked at 5 in the morning. Our little ranch house in Fayetteville buzzed with that perfect kind of chaos that comes with family gatherings. Jake had taken leave from Fort Bragg specifically for this day, and seeing him in civilian clothes, hanging streamers while Nathan giggled from his high chair, made my heart swell with the kind of happiness I thought only existed in commercials. Victoria arrived fashionably late, as always, sweeping through our front door like she owned the place. At 28, she'd perfected the art of making every room revolve around her presence. Her honey blonde hair cascaded in perfect waves, her makeup applied with the precision of someone who made a living being photographed. She ran a successful event planning business in Charlotte and had built a substantial social media following documenting her curated lifestyle. Everything Victoria touched turned into content, and today would be no different. "Oh my goodness, Cassie, this is so adorable," she gushed, immediately pulling out her phone to capture the decorations. "Very rustic farm chic. I love what you've done with the limited space." The compliment carried that subtle sting Victoria had mastered since childhood, the kind that left you unsure whether to say thank you or defend yourself. Mom and Dad arrived shortly after, their arms loaded with gifts wrapped in expensive paper that probably cost more than the presents inside. Robert Matthews had retired from his position as regional bank manager 2 years ago, but he still carried himself with that particular authority that came from decades of making financial decisions that affected people's lives. Helen, my mother, had channeled her empty nest energy into real estate, and her success had given her a confidence that sometimes felt more like superiority. "Where's our birthday boy?" Helen cooed, immediately reaching for Nathan. He went to her willingly, his chubby hands grabbing at her pearl necklace. "Oh, he's gotten so big!" "Victoria, come see how much he's grown since Christmas." Victoria obliged, snapping photos while Helen posed with Nathan. "He's definitely going to be tall like Jake," she observed, then glanced at me with that practiced sisterly smile. "Hopefully he'll get the athletic genes too." I felt Jake's hands settle on my lower back, a gentle reminder of his presence. At 6'3" with the kind of quiet confidence that came from actual accomplishments rather than projected ones, Jake had never needed to prove himself to my family. But he'd never quite fit into their world of social climbing and appearance management either. His idea of success was measured in missions completed and soldiers brought home safely, not in Instagram followers or quarterly profit margins. "The little man's already showing promise," Jake said, his voice carrying that slight North Carolina drawl that became more pronounced when he was around my family. "Yesterday he figured out how to stack his blocks higher than ever before. Kid's got problem-solving skills." Dad chuckled, settling into our second-hand armchair that looked shabby next to Victoria's designer outfit. "That's good. He'll need those skills in today's world. Though I hope you two are thinking about his education fund. College costs are astronomical these days." "We've started a 529 plan," I said, feeling that familiar need to prove we were responsible parents despite our modest income. "Jake's military benefits help, and I'm picking up more freelance graphic design work." "That's smart," Victoria said, bouncing Nathan on her hip while she scrolled through her phone. "Speaking of which, I've been meaning to ask if you'd be interested in doing some design work for my company. I can't pay much, but the exposure would be amazing for your portfolio." The offer should have felt generous, but something in Victoria's tone made it sound more like charity. Before I could respond, Nathan started fussing, reaching his arms toward me. Victoria seemed reluctant to hand him over, holding him just a moment longer than necessary, while she captured one more selfie. "He's probably hungry," I said, finally taking my son back. "I made some fresh baby food this morning. Sweet potato and apple puree." "Oh, don't worry about that," Victoria said brightly, reaching into the oversized designer bag she'd set by the door. "I brought something special for the birthday boy. I've been experimenting with baby food recipes for a potential business venture. Organic, locally sourced, completely homemade." She produced a set of small glass jars with handwritten labels. The presentation was beautiful, each jar tied with a small ribbon and decorated with a sticker featuring cartoon vegetables. "I made these specifically for Nathan. Sweet potato with a hint of cinnamon, pureed carrots with ginger, and apple with just a touch of honey for sweetness." My stomach tightened slightly. "Victoria, you know babies under 1 aren't supposed to have honey, right? It can cause botulism." Her laugh was light and dismissive. "Oh, Cassie, you worry too much. It's just a tiny amount, and he's basically 1-year-old anyway. My friend Madison's been giving her daughter honey since 8 months, and she's perfectly fine. Besides, these recipes are all over Pinterest. Thousands of moms can't be wrong." Jake's expression had shifted almost imperceptibly, but I caught it. The slight narrowing of his eyes, the way his posture straightened just a fraction. Years of marriage had taught me to read these micro-expressions, signs that his tactical mind was processing potential threats. "Actually, the honey thing is serious," he said calmly. "The CDC recommends waiting until after the first birthday because infant digestive systems can't handle the bacteria." Victoria's smile never wavered, but something flickered behind her eyes. "I'm sure one little taste won't hurt anything. I spent hours making these. It would mean so much to me if Nathan could try them on his special day." The room fell into one of those uncomfortable silences that seemed to stretch longer than they actually last. Mom cleared her throat. "Victoria put a lot of effort into this, Cassie. Maybe just a small spoonful?" I felt caught between my instincts as a mother and the familiar pressure to keep peace in my family. Victoria had always been the favored child, the one whose feelings mattered most, whose disappointments became everyone else's responsibility to fix. But this was my son's health we were talking about. "I appreciate the thought," I said carefully, "but I'm not comfortable giving him honey yet. Maybe we could save these for next month?" Victoria's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, her smile becoming more strained. "Of course," she said, but her voice carried a note I recognized from childhood. It was the tone that meant I'd committed some social sin that would be discussed later, dissected and analyzed until I questioned my own judgment. The party continued with the usual family rhythms. We sang Happy Birthday while Nathan smashed his hands into his slice of carrot cake, creating the kind of adorable mess that would fill my phone with photos for months. Victoria documented everything, of course, positioning herself in most of the shots, and making sure her carefully curated outfit remained spotless while the rest of us wiped frosting off our clothes. Around 3 o'clock, Nathan started getting cranky, his usual afternoon fussiness amplified by all the excitement and attention. He'd been passed around between relatives all day, and I could see the overstimulation building in his reddening cheeks and increasingly frequent whimpers. "Poor little guy's getting tired," Jake observed, taking Nathan from Dad's arms. "Want me to try putting him down for a nap?" "Actually," Victoria said, reaching for Nathan again, "why don't I give him a little snack first? All that cake probably threw off his blood sugar. Just a tiny bit of the sweet potato puree? It might help settle his stomach." Before I could object, she'd already taken Nathan and was heading toward the kitchen. "Victoria, wait!" I called, but she was already opening one of her jars. "Just a little taste," she called back. "Look, Nathan, Aunt Victoria made this just for you." I hurried into the kitchen, Jake close behind me, but Victoria was already offering Nathan a spoonful of the orange puree. He accepted it eagerly, the way toddlers do when they're hungry and something looks appealing. "Victoria, I asked you not to." "Relax, Cassie, it's just sweet potato, the one without honey." She fed him another spoonful, ignoring my obvious discomfort. "See? He loves it. Look at that smile." Nathan did seem to enjoy it, reaching for the spoon and making his happy eating sounds. but something about the situation felt wrong. Maybe it was the way Victoria had rushed to feed him before I could stop her, or the slight defensiveness in her voice when she insisted it was honey-free. "Which jar is that?" Jake asked, his voice deceptively casual. Victoria held up the jar, and I could see the label clearly now. "Sweet potato and apple," it read in Victoria's flowing handwriting. No mention of honey. But underneath, in smaller print, I caught something that made my blood run cold. "With natural sweetener." "What kind of natural sweetener?" I asked, trying to keep my voice level. "Oh, just a touch of honey," Victoria said absently, still focused on feeding Nathan. "It really brings out the natural flavors." The spoon clattered to the floor as I reached for my son. "Victoria, you just told me it didn't have honey." "I said the sweet potato one didn't have honey," she corrected, but her confidence was wavering. "This is the sweet potato and apple blend. They're different recipes." Jake was already examining the jar, his movements precise and controlled in the way that meant he was fighting to stay calm. "The label says sweet potato and apple, but underneath it says natural sweetener. You deliberately fed him something you knew Cassie was uncomfortable with."
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
"It's not a big deal," Victoria snapped, her composure finally cracking. "You two are being completely paranoid. It's a tiny amount of honey in a homemade baby food. Millions of babies eat honey every day without problems." "Actually, they don't," Jake said, his voice dropping to that deadly quiet tone I'd only heard him use when discussing serious military matters. "Because most parents listen to pediatric guidelines that exist for a reason." Nathan was still happily gumming the sweet potato mixture, oblivious to the tension crackling around him. But I could see something in his eyes that worried me, a glassy quality that hadn't been there before. "Mom, Dad," Victoria called toward the living room, her voice taking on the plaintive quality she'd used since childhood when she needed backup. "Can you please tell Cassie and Jake that they're overreacting? I made special baby food for Nathan's birthday, and now they're acting like I tried to poison him." My parents appeared in the kitchen doorway, taking in the scene with the practiced efficiency of people who'd mediated between their daughters for decades. "What's going on?" Mom asked, but her tone suggested she'd already decided who was being reasonable and who wasn't. "Cassie's upset because I gave Nathan a tiny taste of homemade baby food," Victoria explained, her eyes already welling with tears. "I spent hours making special recipes for his birthday, and now they won't even let him eat them." "The baby food contains honey," Jake said flatly. "We specifically asked her not to give him anything with honey," she agreed, then fed it to him anyway. Dad sighed, rubbing his temples in the gesture that always preceded his attempts at diplomatic solutions. "Look, I'm sure Victoria didn't mean any harm, and it's probably just a small amount, right? Kids are more resilient than we think." "Robert's right," Mom added, moving to put a protective arm around Victoria. "In my day, we didn't worry so much about every little thing. You two turned out fine, and I'm sure I gave you honey before you were one." I stared at my parents, feeling that familiar sense of displacement that came whenever family conflicts arose. Somehow, my concerns for my child's safety had become the problem, while Victoria's decision to disregard my explicit wishes was being minimized as harmless overenthusiasm. "It's not about resilience," I said, struggling to keep my voice steady. "It's about respecting boundaries as parents. I said no honey, and she gave it to him anyway." "After making it seem like she wasn't going to," Jake added, and I could hear the controlled anger in his voice. "That's not an accident. That's deliberately deceptive." Victoria's tears were flowing freely now, the kind of dramatic display that had always been her trump card in family disputes. "I can't believe you're making me out to be some kind of villain. I love Nathan. I would never do anything to hurt him. I just wanted to make his first birthday special." By ignoring his mother's clearly stated concerns, Jake said, but Victoria was already pushing past us toward the living room. "I'm not staying here to be attacked," she announced to the room. "I spend hours making something special for my nephew, and this is the thanks I get. Accusations and drama." She began gathering her things with the theatrical efficiency of someone who knew how to make an exit. "Mom, Dad, I'll call you later. Maybe, when everyone's calmed down and ready to be rational." The front door closed behind her, with just enough force to communicate displeasure without quite qualifying as a slam. The silence that followed felt heavy with unspoken judgments and unresolved tension. "Well," Dad said finally, that escalated quickly. Mom was already reaching for Nathan, who seemed drowsier than usual. "Poor little guy probably just needs a nap. All this arguing isn't good for children." But Nathan's drowsiness was different from his usual pre-nap fussiness. His movement seemed sluggish, his eyes unfocused in a way that sent alarm bells ringing in my maternal instincts. "Jake," I said quietly, "something's not right." He was already beside me, his trained eye assessing Nathan's condition with the same intensity he'd used to evaluate an injured soldier. "His color's off," he said, taking Nathan from Mom's arms despite her protests. "And look at his breathing. It's too shallow." Within minutes, Nathan went from drowsy to limp, his small body suddenly heavy in ways that terrified me. His breathing became labored, and when I tried to get his attention, his eyes rolled back slightly. "We're going to the hospital," Jake announced, already grabbing his keys and Nathan's diaper bag. "Now." "Don't you think you're overreacting?" Mom asked, but her voice carried less conviction than before. "Maybe he's just overstimulated from the party." "Babies don't go limp from overstimulation," Jake said, already heading for the door with Nathan in his arms. "Cassie, grab his insurance card and your purse. We're leaving." The drive to Cape Fear Valley Medical Center felt both endless and too short. Jake drove with the controlled precision of someone accustomed to high-stakes situations, while I sat in the back seat monitoring Nathan's breathing and trying not to let panic overwhelm my ability to think clearly. Nathan's condition continued to deteriorate during the 20-minute drive. His skin took on a grayish pallor, and his breathing became increasingly shallow. By the time we reached the emergency room, he was barely responsive. The triage nurse took one look at Nathan and immediately called for a pediatric team. Within minutes, we were surrounded by medical professionals asking rapid-fire questions about symptoms, timeline, and potential exposures. When did the symptoms start? Dr. Maria Santos, the attending pediatrician, asked while nurses worked to establish IV access in Nathan's tiny arm. "About 30 minutes after he ate homemade baby food," I said, my voice surprisingly steady despite the terror clawing at my chest. The food contained honey, which we specifically said he couldn't have. Quote, Dr. Santos's expression grew more serious. "How much honey, and what was the consistency of the food?" "I don't know exactly how much," Jake answered. "It was pureed baby food, and he had maybe 3 or 4 spoonfuls." The medical team moved with efficient urgency, running tests and administering treatments, while explaining their actions in the calm, professional tones that somehow made everything feel both more real and more terrifying. "We're seeing signs consistent with infant botulism," Dr. Santos explained after the initial battery of tests. "The honey likely contained botulinum spores, which can be extremely dangerous for children under 12 months. We need to admit him immediately and start supportive care." The next 6 hours blurred together in a haze of medical procedures, insurance forms, and the unique torture of watching your child suffer while feeling completely helpless. Nathan required respiratory support and careful monitoring, as the toxins affected his nervous system. Jake never left my side, but I could see the controlled fury building behind his calm exterior. This wasn't random misfortune or an unavoidable accident. This was the direct result of Victoria's decision to disregard our explicit instructions about our child's safety. Around midnight, when Nathan's condition finally stabilized enough for me to step away briefly, Jake made a phone call. I couldn't hear the entire conversation, but I caught enough to understand that he was speaking to someone from his unit. "I need a background check," he said quietly. "Complete financial, social media, business records, everything legal and available." He rattled off Victoria's full name, date of birth, and current address. "Priority processing. This involves a threat to military family." When he hung up, I met his eyes with a mixture of gratitude and apprehension. "What are you doing?" "My job," he said simply. "Protecting my family." "Victoria didn't just make a mistake, Cassie. She deliberately ignored your instructions and put our son in danger. People like that don't usually start with baby food. There's always a pattern." As Nathan slept fitfully in his hospital bed, monitors beeping softly around us, I began to understand that this incident was about to become something much larger than a family dispute over baby food. Jake approached threats to his family the same way he approached military operations, with thorough intelligence gathering, strategic planning, and absolute commitment to neutralizing the danger. Victoria had made the mistake of thinking she was dealing with a passive brother-in-law who would quietly accept her behavior for the sake of family peace. Instead, she'd targeted the child of a man trained to identify, track, and systematically dismantle threats to national security. The war was just beginning, and Victoria had no idea what kind of enemy she'd made. 3 days after Nathan's release from the hospital, I discovered the first piece of evidence that would change everything. I was organizing the get well cards and flowers that had arrived from Jake's unit when I found Victoria's business card tucked inside a bouquet from my parents. On the back, written in her distinctive handwriting, were the words, "Call me when you're ready to apologize." The audacity of it took my breath away. Our son had nearly died from her reckless disregard for his safety, and she expected an apology from us. I stared at that card for several minutes, feeling something shift inside me. The guilt I'd carried about the confrontation at the party began transforming into something colder and more focused. Jake found me in the kitchen, still holding the card. He took one look at my face and understood immediately. "What did you find?" I handed him the card without speaking. His jaw tightened as he read Victoria's message, but his expression remained controlled. "She's escalating," he said simply. "This is psychological warfare." That afternoon, while Nathan napped peacefully in his crib, Jake's phone buzzed with an encrypted message. Staff Sergeant Kevin Torres, one of Jake's most trusted team members, had completed the preliminary background check on Victoria. The results were more disturbing than either of us had anticipated. "Her business is failing," Jake said, scanning the digital report on his secure phone. "Has been for months. She owes nearly $60,000 in business loans and credit card debt. Her social media following is mostly purchased bots, and she's been inflating her success for years." But the financial troubles were just the beginning. Kevin had discovered a pattern of concerning behavior dating back several years. Victoria had been involved in 3 separate incidents with clients where children had experienced mysterious illnesses after events she'd coordinated. In each case, she'd managed to shift blame onto other vendors or circumstances, but the pattern was unmistakable to someone trained to recognize operational signatures. "There's more," Jake continued, his voice growing grimmer. "She's been posting about Nathan's hospitalization on her social media, but she's framing it as a tragic accident that brought the family together. She's using our son's medical emergency for sympathy content." I felt my hands begin to shake with rage. "Show me!" Jake hesitated, then turned his phone toward me. Victoria's Instagram story featured a carefully filtered photo of herself looking solemn and beautiful, with text overlay reading, "Sometimes life reminds us what really matters. Praying for my precious nephew and sending love to my sister during this difficult time. Family is everything. #PrayerSup, #FamilyFirst, #blessed. The comments below were filled with sympathy and support for Victoria's supposed emotional distress. She'd positioned herself as the grieving aunt, the caring family member dealing with an unexpected tragedy. There was no mention of her role in causing Nathan's illness, no acknowledgement of responsibility, just pure victimhood wrapped in Instagram-worthy aesthetics. "She's building a narrative," Jake observed, his military training evident in how quickly he'd identified Victoria's strategy, creating a version of events where she's the concerned family member, not the person who caused the crisis. That evening, my phone rang. Victoria's name appeared on the screen, and after a moment's hesitation, I answered. "Cassie?" Her voice was soft, carefully modulated to convey concern and hurt. "I've been so worried about Nathan. How is he doing?" "He's recovering," I said cautiously, unsure of her agenda. "I'm so relieved. I've been praying constantly since I heard about the hospital visit. It must have been terrifying for you and Jake." She paused, letting the silence stretch just long enough to feel natural. "I keep thinking about our argument at the party. I feel terrible that we fought on Nathan's special day." The manipulation was so smooth, so practiced, that I almost found myself falling into the familiar pattern of accepting responsibility for the conflict. But Nathan's pale face in that hospital bed was still too fresh in my memory. "Victoria, You gave him honey after we explicitly asked you not to. I know, and I've felt sick about it ever since. But Cassie, you have to understand, I never thought such a tiny amount could cause problems. I've been researching infant botulism, and it's incredibly rare. Most babies who are exposed don't get sick at all. The careful way she phrased her response set off alarm bells. She'd been researching infant botulism, which meant she now knew exactly how dangerous her actions had been. Yet she was still minimizing the risk and deflecting responsibility. The point isn't how rare it is, I said firmly. The point is that we asked you not to give him honey. And you did it anyway. You're absolutely right, Victoria said, her voice taking on that practiced tone of someone who'd learned to give partial apologies that sounded complete. I should have listened to your concerns. I was just so excited about sharing something special with Nathan, and I let my enthusiasm override my judgment. It was a masterful non-apology, acknowledging fault while simultaneously explaining it away as loving over-enthusiasm rather than deliberate disregard for our wishes. What I'm really calling about, Victoria continued, is to see if there's anything I can do to help. I know medical bills can be overwhelming, and I want to contribute to Nathan's care. The offer should have sounded generous, but something about the timing felt calculated. We have insurance, I said. Nathan's treatment is covered. Of course, but there are always unexpected expenses, and I know Jake's military salary doesn't leave much room for emergencies. I'd like to set up a GoFundMe for Nathan's medical costs. I have a substantial social media following, and I could raise significant funds to help your family. The proposal made my skin crawl. Victoria wanted to profit from Nathan's illness by positioning herself as the hero organizing financial support for her nephew's medical crisis. She'd already used his hospitalization for sympathy content, and now she wanted to monetize it further while appearing generous and family-oriented. That's not necessary, I said firmly. We're managing fine. Cassie, pride shouldn't prevent you from accepting help when your child needs it. I feel partially responsible for what happened, and I want to make it right. Partially responsible. Even in her offer to help, she couldn't fully acknowledge her role in causing Nathan's illness. It was always partial responsibility, minimal culpability, shared blame that somehow diminished her accountability while maintaining her image as the caring family member trying to help. After I hung up, Jake asked about the conversation. When I relayed Victoria's offer to set up a GoFundMe, his expression darkened. She's trying to control the narrative, he said. If she's the one organizing fundraising efforts, she becomes the hero of the story instead of the villain. It's textbook crisis management. That night, Jake made another call to Kevin Torres. This time, the conversation lasted over an hour and covered topics I could only partially follow. They discussed social media analysis, financial investigations, and something called pattern recognition algorithms that could identify behavioral signatures across multiple platforms. Kevin's going to expand the investigation, Jake explained after hanging up. We're looking at her entire digital footprint, business practices, and any legal issues that might not show up in standard background checks. I should have felt uncomfortable with the level of surveillance Jake was arranging, but Nathan's face in that hospital bed had changed something fundamental in my perspective. Victoria wasn't just my difficult sister anymore. She was someone who had deliberately endangered my child and was now trying to profit from the aftermath. The next morning brought a new development that confirmed Jake's suspicions about Victoria's strategic thinking. My mother called, her voice carefully neutral in the way that usually preceded difficult conversations. Cassie, honey, Victoria called me last night. She's very upset about how things were left after the party. I waited, knowing there was more coming. She feels like you and Jake have been unfairly blaming her for Nathan's illness. She said the doctors couldn't definitively prove that the honey caused his problems, and that there could have been other factors. The lie was so bold, so easily disproven, that it took me a moment to respond. Mom. The doctors specifically diagnosed infant botulism caused by honey exposure. It's in Nathan's medical records. Well, Victoria said that infant botulism has many possible causes, and that honey is just one potential source. She's been researching it extensively, and she thinks the doctors might have jumped to conclusions. Victoria had clearly been busy rewriting the medical facts to support her preferred version of events. She was systematically undermining the established diagnosis and replacing it with uncertainty and alternative explanations. She also mentioned that she's concerned about Nathan's ongoing health. Mom continued. She wants to help with his medical care, but she feels like you're shutting her out because you need someone to blame for what happened. The manipulation was breathtaking in its complexity. Victoria had positioned herself as the knowledgeable researcher, questioning medical conclusions, the generous family member offering financial support, and the victim of unfair blame from grieving parents looking for someone to hold responsible. Mom, she gave Nathan honey after we specifically told her not to. That's not a matter of interpretation. Accidents happen, sweetheart. Victoria never intended for Nathan to get sick. She loves him dearly, and I think you need to consider forgiveness. Holding on to anger isn't healthy for anyone. After hanging up, I realized that Victoria had successfully recruited my mother as an advocate for her version of events. The woman who had deliberately fed my son a substance she knew we'd forbidden was now being presented as the victim of our unreasonable anger and unwillingness to forgive innocent mistakes. Jake's investigation was revealing similar patterns in Victoria's business dealings. Kevin had identified at least 6 clients who had reported problems after events Victoria had coordinated, but in each case, she'd managed to avoid legal liability through carefully worded contracts and strategic blame shifting. One former client, a woman named Patricia Williams who had hired Victoria to plan her daughter's baptism celebration, had left a detailed review on a wedding planning forum, describing how several children had become ill after eating catered food at the event. Victoria had blamed the caterer, who had blamed the venue's kitchen facilities, and the circular blame had continued until the original complainants gave up pursuing the matter. Another client had reported that Victoria had used decorations and flowers that triggered severe allergic reactions in multiple guests, but Victoria had claimed the clients had failed to disclose all allergies and had refused to take responsibility for medical expenses. The pattern was becoming clear. Victoria had a history of making decisions that endangered others, particularly children, and then using manipulation, deflection, and legal maneuvering to avoid consequences. Nathan's poisoning wasn't an isolated incident of poor judgment. It was the latest example of a behavioral pattern that had been developing for years. Jake shared these findings with me carefully, understanding that learning about Victoria's history of endangering children would be particularly difficult to process. But I needed to understand what we were dealing with. She's not going to stop, Jake said quietly. This is who she is. She makes dangerous decisions, hurts people, and then manipulates situations to avoid accountability. Nathan won't be her last victim unless we do something to stop her. That afternoon, Victoria posted another Instagram story featuring a photo of herself holding a bouquet of flowers with the caption, "Sending healing thoughts and prayers to my sweet nephew." Sometimes God allows difficult things to happen to bring families closer together. Grateful for every lesson and every blessing. #FaithOverFear, #FamilyLove, #HealingJourney. The post had dozens of supportive comments from followers praising Victoria's strength during, quote, "this difficult time," and admiring her positive attitude in the face of family tragedy. She'd successfully framed Nathan's hospitalization as a test of faith that was bringing the family together, rather than as the consequence of her dangerous actions. But Victoria had made a crucial error in her latest post. She'd included a timestamp and location tag that placed her at an upscale flower shop in Charlotte at the exact time she'd claimed to be at the hospital praying for Nathan's recovery. Jake noticed the discrepancy immediately. "She's creating false narratives about her involvement," he observed, taking screenshots of the post and its metadata. "This proves she's deliberately constructing a fictional version of events." Kevin Torres had also made progress on the financial investigation. Victoria's business debts were even more extensive than initially reported, and she was facing potential bankruptcy within the next 6 months. More concerning, she'd been approaching family members individually, asking for loans to cover, quote, "temporary business expenses," while hiding the true extent of her financial crisis. "She borrowed $5,000 from your Uncle David last month," Jake reported. "Told him it was for expanding her business into corporate event planning. She's been giving different stories to different family members about why she needs money." The picture emerging was of someone whose carefully curated public image was collapsing under the weight of financial failure and poor business decisions. Victoria had been living beyond her means for years, maintaining an expensive lifestyle through debt and family loans while her actual income steadily declined. But the most disturbing discovery came when Kevin accessed public court records and found that Victoria had been named in a civil lawsuit filed 6 months earlier. A client had sued her for gross negligence after a child had suffered serious injuries at an event Victoria had planned. The case had been quietly settled out of court with a substantial payment and a non-disclosure agreement. "She's done this before," Jake said grimly. "And she's been using legal settlements and NDAs to keep her victims quiet. That's why we couldn't find any public record of complaints. She's been paying to bury the evidence." The revelation changed everything. Nathan's poisoning wasn't an isolated incident of poor judgment or family drama. It was part of a pattern of dangerous behavior that Victoria had been concealing through legal manipulation and financial settlements. She was essentially a repeat offender who had learned to use the legal system to hide her history of endangering children. That evening, Zoe Parker, my best friend and a pediatric nurse at Cape Fear Valley Medical Center, called with information that made the situation even more serious. "Cassie, I need to tell you something about Nathan's case, but you didn't hear this from me." Zoe's voice was tense with the careful tone of someone about to share confidential information. The attending physician filed a mandatory report with Child Protective Services about Nathan's hospitalization. My heart stopped. "What kind of report?" "Any case of infant botulism has to be reported as a potential child endangerment incident. It's automatic protocol. CPS will be conducting an investigation to determine if Nathan was exposed to honey through parental negligence, or if there were other circumstances involved." The implications hit me immediately. If CPS determined that Nathan had been endangered through our negligence as parents, it could affect Jake's military security clearance and potentially impact his career. Even if we were eventually cleared of wrongdoing, the investigation itself would become part of Nathan's permanent medical record and could follow our family for years. "There's more," Zoe continued reluctantly. "Someone called the hospital yesterday asking questions about Nathan's case. They claimed to be a family member conducting research for potential legal action, but they were asking very specific questions about the medical findings and whether the honey exposure could be definitively proven." Victoria was already working to undermine the medical evidence that proved her culpability. She was researching ways to challenge the diagnosis and create reasonable doubt about the cause of Nathan's illness. The woman who had poisoned our son was now actively working to escape responsibility while positioning herself as a concerned family member seeking justice. Jake's response was immediate and decisive. "We're done playing defense," he said after I relayed Zoe's information. "It's time to go on the offensive." He spent the next 2 hours on encrypted calls with contacts I didn't recognize, speaking in the kind of operational language that reminded me that my husband's job involved much more than I usually thought about. When he finally finished, his expression was grimmer than I'd ever seen it. "Victoria has 48 hours to make a choice," Jake said quietly. "She can voluntarily enter a treatment program for her behavioral issues, surrender her business license, and make full financial restitution to Nathan's medical expenses, or we go public with everything we've found." I stared at him, understanding that we'd crossed a line from family dispute into something that resembled warfare. "What if she refuses?" Jake's smile was cold and entirely without humor. "Then she discovers what happens when someone threatens a Delta Force operator's family. We don't just get even, Cassie. We get thorough." Victoria's response came exactly 36 hours later, delivered not through a phone call or text message, but through a registered letter that arrived at our front door via certified mail. The formal delivery method should have been my first warning that she'd consulted with legal counsel before crafting her reply. Inside the thick cream envelope was a 2-page letter written on Victoria's business letterhead, each paragraph carefully constructed with the precision of someone who understood they were creating a legal document rather than family correspondence. The tone was professional, distant, and entirely devoid of the emotional manipulation that had characterized her previous communications. "Dear Cassie and Jake," the letter began, "I am in receipt of your recent communication regarding Nathan's medical incident and the allegations you have made concerning my role in his hospitalization. After careful consideration and consultation with legal counsel, I must respectfully decline your proposed resolution." She went on to systematically deny every allegation Jake's investigation had uncovered, characterizing his findings as unsubstantiated rumors and coincidental circumstances that do not establish any pattern of negligent behavior. Her attorney had clearly coached her on the specific language needed to avoid admitting liability while still appearing to address our concerns. But it was the final paragraph that revealed Victoria's true strategy. "Furthermore, I have been advised that your recent activities constitute harassment and potentially defamatory behavior that could damage my business reputation and personal standing in the community. I trust that you will cease these activities immediately and focus your attention on Nathan's continued recovery, rather than pursuing vindictive actions against family members who are also concerned about his well-being." Jake read the letter twice before setting it down on our kitchen table with the kind of careful control that meant he was fighting to contain his reaction. "She's declaring war," he said quietly. "This isn't just a refusal to cooperate. She's threatening us with legal action if we don't back down." The letter represented a complete escalation from family drama to formal legal conflict. Victoria had abandoned any pretense of accepting responsibility and was now actively positioning herself as the victim of our allegedly unreasonable demands and invasive investigation into her private affairs. But Victoria had made a crucial miscalculation. In consulting with her attorney and adopting a formal legal stance, she'd also provided Jake with the justification he needed to respond with the full resources at his disposal. Her letter wasn't just a refusal to cooperate, it was a declaration that she intended to fight rather than accept accountability for endangering Nathan. That afternoon, Jake made a series of calls that I could only partially follow, speaking to contacts whose names and titles suggested they operated at levels of military and government authority I'd never considered. The conversations were brief, technical, and conducted in the kind of operational language that reminded me how little I understood about the true scope of Jake's professional capabilities. By evening, he'd assembled what he called a comprehensive response package that went far beyond anything I'd imagined possible. Kevin Torres had worked with military intelligence analysts to create a detailed profile of Victoria's behavioral patterns, financial irregularities, and business practices that read like a counterintelligence report on a foreign operative. "She thinks she's dealing with an angry brother-in-law who'll back down when threatened with lawyers," Jake explained as he showed me the thick folder of documentation they'd compiled. "She has no idea that threatening my family just moved her from a personal problem to a national security concern." The designation wasn't hyperbole. Jake's security clearance gave him access to classified information that could affect national defense, and any threat to his family's stability was automatically treated as a potential vulnerability that enemy agents might exploit. Victoria's pattern of dangerous behavior, combined with her financial desperation and willingness to manipulate family relationships, had triggered protocols designed to protect military personnel from blackmail and coercion. "What does that mean practically?" I asked, though part of me wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. "It means that as of this morning, Victoria Matthews is subject to a formal security investigation that will examine every aspect of her life, finances, and relationships," Jake said. "It means that her business licenses, tax returns, and legal settlements are now under federal review. And it means that anyone who has been enabling or financing her activities is about to face some very uncomfortable questions." The scope of the investigation was staggering. Federal agents would be reviewing Victoria's business practices, interviewing her clients and vendors, and examining her financial records with the kind of thoroughness usually reserved for suspected terrorists or foreign agents. Her social media accounts, email communications, and digital footprint would be analyzed by professionals trained to identify deception, manipulation, and potential security threats. But the most immediate consequence was that Victoria's attempt to threaten us with legal action had triggered protective measures designed to shield military families from harassment and intimidation. Her registered letter, which she'd intended as a show of legal force, was now evidence in a federal file documenting threats against military personnel. The first sign that Victoria was beginning to understand the gravity of her situation came 3 days later when she called my phone at 7 in the morning, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. "Cassie, what the hell did Jake do?" she demanded without preamble. "I just got a call from my bank saying my business accounts are under federal review. They've frozen my credit lines and demanded documentation for every transaction over the past 2 years." I felt a mixture of satisfaction and apprehension at the fear in her voice. "I don't know what you're talking about, Victoria." "Don't lie to me, this has Jake's fingerprints all over it. Military connections, federal investigations, the whole 9 yards. My attorney says this level of scrutiny only happens when someone has serious government connections and knows how to use them." Her panic was justified. The financial review alone would expose the full extent of her fraudulent business practices, unpaid taxes, and misappropriated client funds. But it was just the beginning of what Jake had set in motion. "Maybe you should have thought about that before you poisoned my son and then threatened us with legal action," I said, surprised by the coldness in my own voice. "I didn't poison anyone." Victoria's composure was cracking completely. "Nathan got sick from something he ate, but there's no proof it was from anything I gave him. The doctors can't even be certain about the cause." The lie was so transparent, so desperately maintained, despite all evidence to the contrary, that it crystallized something important for me. Victoria wasn't just avoiding responsibility, she was living in a completely alternate reality where her actions never had negative consequences, and any problems that arose were always someone else's fault. "The medical records are very clear about the cause of Nathan's illness," I said firmly. "Infant botulism caused by honey exposure. Your honey, Victoria. From the baby food you insisted on feeding him, despite our explicit objections. That's circumstantial evidence at best." She shot back, falling back on the legal language her attorney had obviously coached her to use. "Correlation doesn't prove causation, and there are multiple potential sources of exposure that weren't properly investigated." But her attempt to sound legally sophisticated only highlighted how desperately she was scrambling to create doubt about established medical facts. The woman who had fed my son honey against my wishes was now trying to argue that medical professionals had somehow misdiagnosed the resulting illness. "Victoria, just stop," I said tiredly. "You gave Nathan honey. He got sick. You caused it. All the legal language in the world isn't going to change those basic facts." "Fine," she snapped, abandoning the pretense of legal precision. "Maybe I made a mistake with the honey. But that doesn't justify destroying my entire life over one small error in judgment. Jake is using his military connections to ruin me financially and professionally, because he can't handle the fact that accidents happen." The admission was significant, but it came wrapped in the same minimization and blame shifting that characterized all of Victoria's responses to criticism. Even when forced to acknowledge her role in Nathan's illness, she immediately reduced it to a small error in judgment and repositioned herself as the victim of Jake's excessive retaliation. "It wasn't an accident," I said. "You deliberately fed him something we told you not to give him. That's not an error in judgment. That's a decision to ignore our parental authority over our own child." "I was trying to do something nice for my nephew." Victoria's voice rose to a near shriek. "I spent hours making special baby food for his birthday, and instead of being grateful, you two turned it into some kind of federal case." Literally, apparently. The irony of her complaint wasn't lost on me. Victoria had literally turned Nathan's poisoning into a legal case by threatening us with defamation suits, and now she was outraged that Jake had responded with superior legal resources. That afternoon brought confirmation that the federal investigation was proceeding with devastating efficiency. Kevin Torres called Jake with an update that revealed just how thoroughly Victoria's life was being dissected by professional investigators. Her business license is under review by the State Commerce Department. Kevin reported during a call I was allowed to overhear. They found irregularities in her tax filings, unreported income, and evidence of client fund misappropriation. The IRS has opened a formal audit, and the State Attorney General's office is considering fraud charges. But the financial crimes were just one aspect of the investigation. Federal agents had also interviewed several of Victoria's former clients. And a pattern of dangerous behavior was emerging that went far beyond what Jake's initial research had uncovered. We found 4 additional incidents involving children's safety at events she coordinated. Kevin continued. In each case, she made decisions that endangered minors, then used legal pressure and financial settlements to avoid accountability. There's documentation of at least $15,000 in settlement payments over the past 3 years. The scope of Victoria's misconduct was staggering. She'd been systematically endangering children at events for years, then using her business insurance and personal funds to pay off families rather than change her dangerous practices. Nathan wasn't just her latest victim. He was part of an established pattern of child endangerment that she'd been concealing through financial manipulation. The most serious incident happened 18 months ago, Kevin added grimly. A 4-year-old girl suffered severe allergic reactions at a birthday party Victoria planned. The child required emergency medical treatment and was hospitalized for 3 days. Victoria paid the family $40,000 to avoid criminal charges. I felt sick listening to the details of Victoria's hidden history. She'd been hurting children for years, paying their families to stay quiet, and continuing to operate her business as if nothing had happened. The woman I'd grown up with, who I'd thought was simply self-centered and irresponsible, was actually someone who systematically endangered children and used money to escape consequences. But the investigation had also uncovered evidence that Victoria's dangerous behavior was escalating rather than improving over time. The intervals between incidents were getting shorter, the settlements were getting larger, and her financial resources were becoming increasingly strained by the cost of covering up her misconduct. She's approaching a crisis point, Jake observed, after reviewing Kevin's full report. Her business is failing, she can't afford to keep paying settlements, and she's running out of family members to borrow money from. That makes her more dangerous, not less. The psychological profile that military analysts had developed painted a picture of someone whose behavior was likely to become more extreme as her options for avoiding accountability diminished. Victoria had built her entire adult identity around maintaining a facade of success and competence while hiding a pattern of dangerous decision-making. As that facade crumbled under federal scrutiny, she was likely to become increasingly desperate and unpredictable. That evening, my parents called for what they described as an emergency family meeting. Their voices were strained with the kind of stress that comes from discovering that someone you've supported and defended has been living a completely fabricated life. "We need to talk about Victoria," Dad said without his usual diplomatic preamble. "We've been contacted by federal investigators asking questions about loans we've made to her business, and whether we were aware of any irregular practices." The conversation that followed was perhaps the most difficult our family had ever had. My parents were forced to confront the reality that their favored daughter, whom they'd consistently defended and financially supported, had been using their money to pay off families whose children she'd endangered. "They asked us about the $15,000 we lent her last spring," Mom said, her voice hollow with shock. "Victoria told us it was for equipment and inventory, but the investigators showed us bank records proving she used the money for legal settlements." Dad's face had aged years in the past week as he processed the scope of Victoria's deception. "She's been lying to us for years about everything. Her business success, her financial situation, the reasons she needed money. We've been unwittingly funding her ability to hurt children and avoid responsibility." The revelation was devastating for my parents, who prided themselves on their judgment and their children's achievements. Learning that they'd been systematically deceived and manipulated by Victoria while simultaneously diminishing my concerns about her behavior represented a complete inversion of their understanding of family dynamics. "The worst part," Mom continued tearfully, "is that we defended her against you. When you tried to set boundaries about Nathan, we told you that you were being unreasonable. We made you feel guilty for protecting your own child because we believed Victoria's version of events. The apology was long overdue, but it came at a cost I wouldn't have wished on anyone." My parents' faith in their own judgment had been shattered by the discovery that they'd been enablers in Victoria's pattern of child endangerment. But Victoria wasn't finished fighting. The next morning brought evidence that she was escalating her campaign against us. rather than accepting the inevitable collapse of her carefully constructed facade. Zoe called me at 8 a.m. with urgent information from the hospital. Cassie, someone filed a complaint with the state medical board questioning Nathan's diagnosis and treatment. They're claiming that the doctors made errors in their assessment, and that Nathan might have been harmed by unnecessary medical interventions. The audacity of Victoria's latest strategy was breathtaking. Having failed to intimidate us with legal threats, she was now attempting to undermine the medical professionals who had saved Nathan's life. Her complaint alleged that doctors had rushed to judgment about the cause of his illness and subjected him to traumatic treatments based on incomplete evidence. She's trying to create an official record questioning the medical diagnosis, Jake said after I explained Zoe's call. If she can get state medical authorities to investigate the doctor's decisions, she can claim there's official doubt about whether honey exposure actually caused Nathan's illness. The strategy revealed the depth of Victoria's desperation and her complete willingness to harm others in service of protecting herself. She was now targeting the medical professionals who had saved our son's life, potentially damaging their careers and reputations in her effort to escape accountability for poisoning him. But Victoria had once again underestimated the resources Jake could bring to bear against threats to our family. Within hours of learning about her complaint to the medical board, he'd contacted the base legal office and initiated formal military protection protocols for family members of classified personnel facing harassment. The response was swift and comprehensive. Military legal specialists contacted the state medical board to provide classified briefings on the national security implications of attacks on military families through fraudulent medical complaints. Victoria's complaint was not only dismissed but flagged as a potential security threat requiring federal monitoring. More importantly, her attack on the medical professionals had crossed a line that triggered additional federal protections. Attempts to intimidate or retaliate against healthcare providers treating military families were classified as domestic terrorism under certain circumstances, and Victoria's pattern of escalating attacks was now being evaluated under those criteria. She just moved from being a family problem to being a homeland security issue, Jake explained with grim satisfaction. Attacking medical professionals who treat military dependents puts her in a category of threat that brings federal resources I couldn't access for personal family disputes. The designation meant that Victoria was now subject to the kind of comprehensive surveillance and investigation usually reserved for suspected domestic terrorists. Her communications would be monitored, her movements tracked, and her associations analyzed for potential security threats. But perhaps most importantly, any further attempts to attack our family, the medical professionals who had treated Nathan, or the investigators examining her business practices would be treated as federal crimes rather than civil disputes. Victoria's war against our family had reached the point where she was fighting not just Jake's personal resources, but the full protective apparatus of the United States military and federal law enforcement. She'd transformed herself from a troubled family member into a legitimate security threat through her own escalating pattern of attacks and intimidation. The irony was perfect. In her desperation to avoid accountability for poisoning Nathan, Victoria had made choices that brought far more serious consequences than anything we could have imposed through family pressure or civil litigation. Her attempt to escape responsibility had made her a federal criminal. That evening, as Nathan played peacefully in his playpen, oblivious to the war being fought over his poisoning, I realized that Jake had been right from the beginning. Victoria wasn't going to stop until she was forced to stop, and the only force capable of stopping someone with her resources and desperation was the systematic application of federal law enforcement. She'd wanted to play legal hardball with the Delta Force commander's family. Now she was about to discover exactly what that meant. The federal agents arrived at Victoria's Charlotte apartment at 6 a.m. on a Tuesday, their black SUVs parked strategically to block all potential exit routes from the building. Special Agent Diana Walsh, the lead investigator on what was now classified as a domestic terrorism case, had coordinated the operation with military precision that would have impressed Jake if he'd been present to witness it. Victoria's social media accounts went silent that morning for the first time in 3 years. No carefully curated breakfast photos. No inspirational quotes about overcoming adversity. No strategic posts designed to maintain her facade of successful entrepreneurship. The woman who had built her identity around constant digital self-promotion simply vanished from the internet as federal agents executed search warrants on her apartment, storage units, and business offices. I learned about the raids from Kevin Torres, who called Jake with updates as the operation unfolded. The scope of evidence being seized was staggering. Financial records dating back 5 years, client files documenting numerous safety violations, and digital communications that revealed the true extent of Victoria's manipulation and deception. They found a safe in her bedroom containing over $40,000 in cash, Kevin reported. All small bills, consistent with settlement payments made to avoid official banking records. She's been operating a shadow financial system to hide the extent of her liability payments. But the cash was just the beginning of what federal investigators discovered in Victoria's apartment. Hidden in a closet was a banker's box containing legal documents, non-disclosure agreements, and medical records from children who had been injured at events she'd coordinated. Victoria had been collecting evidence of her own crimes, apparently keeping trophies of the families she'd silenced through financial pressure. There's also a detailed spreadsheet on her computer tracking potential liability exposure, Kevin continued. She's been calculating the costs of settlements versus the profits from each event, literally budgeting for how much child endangerment she could afford. The revelation was nauseating. Victoria hadn't been accidentally harming children through poor judgment or negligence. She'd been making calculated decisions about acceptable levels of risk based on her ability to pay off victims and avoid criminal prosecution. Nathan's poisoning wasn't an isolated incident of family drama. It was a business decision made by someone who had systematically monetized child endangerment. Jake's expression grew darker as Kevin detailed each piece of evidence the federal agents had discovered. She's been running a criminal enterprise disguised as an event planning business, he said grimly. This isn't about family conflict anymore. This is about stopping a predator who's been targeting children for profit. The federal investigation had also uncovered Victoria's contingency plans for escaping accountability if her activities were ever exposed. Bank records showed that she'd been moving money to offshore accounts and had obtained a second passport using her middle name and mother's maiden name. She'd been preparing to flee the country if her criminal activities were discovered. She was planning to disappear, Kevin explained. The offshore accounts contained nearly $200,000, and she'd already researched countries without extradition treaties. If we hadn't moved when we did, she might have vanished before facing justice. But Victoria's most damaging mistake was documented in her personal communications, which federal agents had been monitoring since her activities were classified as a security threat. Text messages between Victoria and her attorney revealed that she'd been planning additional attacks against our family, including attempts to have Nathan removed from our custody through false child abuse allegations. She was going to claim that Jake's military training made him prone to violence, and that you were suffering from postpartum depression that impaired your judgment, Kevin read from the intercepted communications. Her attorney was advising her to create documentation of alleged domestic violence and child neglect that could be used to petition for Nathan's removal. The scope of Victoria's planned retaliation was breathtaking in its cruelty and sophistication. She'd been prepared to destroy our family through false accusations of child abuse, using the legal system to separate us from Nathan while positioning herself as the concerned aunt protecting him from dangerous parents. The attorney has also been arrested, Kevin added. He was advising her on how to fabricate evidence and file false reports with Child Protective Services. This was a conspiracy to commit multiple felonies, not legal advice. Within hours of the federal raids, Victoria's carefully constructed social media empire began collapsing, as former clients and business associates came forward with their own stories of fraud, manipulation, and endangerment. The investigation had given victims permission to speak publicly about experiences they'd been forced to hide through non-disclosure agreements and financial settlements. Patricia Williams, the mother whose daughter had suffered severe allergic reactions at an event Victoria had planned, posted a detailed account on Facebook, describing how Victoria had deliberately used decorations she knew would trigger the child's allergies, then pressured the family to accept a settlement rather than pursue criminal charges. She told us that pursuing legal action would traumatize our daughter further, and that accepting her generous settlement offer was the most loving thing we could do as parents, Patricia wrote. We now understand that we were enabling her to continue hurting other children by staying silent about what she did to ours. Another former client, a woman named Sandra Chen, whose son had been hospitalized after eating contaminated food at a birthday party Victoria had coordinated, described similar tactics of manipulation and financial pressure designed to silence victims rather than address safety concerns. Victoria presented herself as a victim of circumstances beyond her control, but we now know that she'd been cutting costs by using expired ingredients and ignoring food safety protocols, Sandra's post explained. She paid us $25,000 to sign an NDA, money we now realize came from other families she was simultaneously defrauding. The testimonials created a cascade effect, as more victims found the courage to speak publicly about their experiences with Victoria's business practices. What had appeared to be isolated incidents of poor judgment were revealed as elements of a systematic pattern of criminal behavior spanning several years. But perhaps the most devastating revelation came from Lisa Chen, Victoria's former assistant, who had been granted immunity in exchange for her cooperation with federal investigators. Lisa's testimony revealed that Victoria had been deliberately targeting events involving young children because they were less likely to articulate what had happened to them, and their parents were more easily manipulated through guilt and fear. She specifically marketed to families with children under 5 because she said they were more manageable when problems arose. Lisa told investigators in a recorded statement that was later released to the media. She kept detailed notes about which families had money for legal action and which ones could be intimidated into staying quiet. Lisa's testimony also revealed that Victoria had been using her social media platform to identify potential victims, studying family photos and posts to determine which children had allergies, medical conditions, or dietary restrictions that could be exploited to create dangerous situations. She would deliberately incorporate elements that she knew would cause problems, then position herself as the caring vendor, trying to help families deal with unexpected emergencies, Lisa explained. It was all calculated to create situations where she could offer financial settlements that looked generous, while actually protecting her from much larger liability exposure. The psychological profile that emerged from Lisa's testimony painted a picture of someone who had weaponized event planning to systematically abuse children and manipulate their families. Victoria wasn't just negligent or irresponsible. She was a predator who had found a socially acceptable way to harm children while maintaining the appearance of being a caring professional. Meanwhile, the financial investigation had revealed that Victoria's business had been essentially a money laundering operation disguised as event planning. She'd been inflating costs, billing for services never provided, and using client payments to fund her lifestyle, while setting aside settlement money for inevitable liability claims. Her actual business income was less than $30,000 per year, federal investigators determined. Everything else was fraudulent billing, misappropriated client funds, and money she'd borrowed under false pretenses. She's been living entirely off criminal proceeds for at least 3 years. The scope of Victoria's financial crimes extended far beyond her event planning business. She'd been running credit card fraud schemes, filing false insurance claims, and even stealing from family members who had trusted her with access to their financial accounts. She used your mother's credit card to make over $15,000 in personal purchases last year, Kevin informed us during one of his regular updates. She'd been systematically stealing from family members while positioning herself as the financially successful daughter who occasionally needed small loans. My parents were devastated by the revelation that Victoria had been stealing from them, while simultaneously manipulating them into defending her against my concerns about her behavior. The woman they'd supported financially and emotionally had been robbing them while using their own money to pay off the families of children she'd endangered. But Victoria's crimes had also extended into areas that directly threatened national security. Federal investigators discovered that she'd been researching military families in the area, apparently planning to target events for dependents of personnel with high-level security clearances. She had files on over 20 military families, Agent Walsh informed Jake during a classified briefing. She'd been identifying events where she could gain access to information about deployment schedules, security protocols, and family vulnerabilities that could be exploited by foreign agents. Whether Victoria had intended to sell information to foreign governments or simply use it for her own criminal purposes was unclear, but her research into military families had triggered the highest levels of security concern. She'd unknowingly stumbled into activities that were classified as espionage preparation under federal law. The military connection also explained why Jake's initial request for assistance had received such rapid and comprehensive response. Victoria's pattern of targeting military families, combined with her financial desperation and willingness to commit serious crimes, had made her a legitimate national security threat regardless of her original intentions. As federal investigators continued building their case, Victoria remained in custody without bail, classified as a flight risk due to her offshore accounts and preparation for international escape. Her attorney had been disbarred and was facing his own criminal charges for conspiracy to commit fraud and obstruct justice. But Victoria's most desperate move came from federal detention, where she attempted to negotiate a plea agreement by offering information about other criminals she claimed to have worked with. The proposal revealed that she'd been involved in criminal networks that extended far beyond her individual activities. She's claiming to have information about organized fraud rings targeting military families across multiple states, Agent Walsh explained. She says she can provide names, methods, and evidence of a conspiracy involving dozens of criminals, specifically targeting government personnel and their dependents. The offer suggested that Victoria's criminal activities had been even more extensive than federal investigators had initially suspected. Rather than being an isolated predator, she might have been part of a larger criminal organization that specialized in exploiting military families and government personnel. We're evaluating her claims, Agent Walsh continued, but her credibility is questionable given her history of manipulation and deception. She might be fabricating connections to other criminals in hopes of negotiating a reduced sentence. Regardless of whether Victoria's claims about larger criminal conspiracies were accurate, her case had already triggered comprehensive security reviews of event vendors, contractors, and service providers who had access to military installations and personnel. The Department of Defense was implementing new screening protocols to prevent other criminals from targeting military families through seemingly legitimate business relationships. The investigation had also prompted congressional hearings on the vulnerability of military families to predators who specifically targeted them because of their frequent relocations, financial pressures, and limited local support networks. Victoria's case was being used as an example of how criminals could exploit the unique challenges faced by military dependents. But perhaps the most significant development was that Nathan's medical records had been classified as evidence in a federal terrorism case, which meant that any future attempts to question his diagnosis or treatment would be treated as attacks on national security. Victoria's desperate attempts to undermine the medical evidence of her crime had inadvertently given Nathan's case the highest possible level of federal protection. No one will ever be able to question what happened to Nathan again, Jake explained with satisfaction. His medical records are now protected by federal law, and anyone who tries to challenge the diagnosis will be investigated as a potential security threat. The classification meant that Victoria's poisoning of Nathan was now officially recognized as an act of domestic terrorism, carrying potential sentences of life in federal prison. Her attempt to escape accountability for giving honey to a baby had escalated into federal crimes that could result in her spending the rest of her life in custody. As the scope of Victoria's criminal enterprise became public, media attention began focusing on the case as an example of how predators could hide in plain sight while systematically targeting children. National news organizations were covering the story as both a cautionary tale about event planning safety and a terrorism case involving threats to military families. Victoria's social media accounts, which had been seized as evidence, were being analyzed by federal experts as examples of how criminals could use online platforms to identify and target victims. Her carefully curated posts about family events and child-friendly activities were revealed as reconnaissance for potential crimes rather than legitimate business marketing. The woman who had built her identity around social media success and carefully crafted online persona was now being studied by law enforcement agencies as a case study in digital predation and victim identification through social media platforms. But the most satisfying aspect of Victoria's downfall was that it had been entirely self-inflicted. Every escalation, every desperate attempt to avoid accountability, every attack on our family had only made her situation worse. Her refusal to accept responsibility for poisoning Nathan had transformed a family dispute into a federal terrorism case that would follow her for the rest of her life. Jake's systematic response to her threat had worked exactly as intended. Rather than engaging in emotional retaliation or family drama, he'd applied the same strategic thinking he used in military operations to comprehensively neutralize a threat to his family. Victoria had discovered too late that threatening a Delta Force commander's child brought consequences she was completely unprepared to handle. The war was nearly over, and Victoria had lost more thoroughly than she could have imagined when she first decided to feed honey to a baby whose parents had explicitly forbidden it. The courthouse steps felt cold beneath my feet as I watched Victoria being led away in federal custody for the final time. She'd aged years in the 6 months since her arrest, her once perfect appearance now hollow and brittle. The designer clothes had been replaced by an orange jumpsuit, and the confident smile that had manipulated so many people was gone completely. Judge Patricia Williams had just sentenced Victoria to 25 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. The charges included domestic terrorism, conspiracy to commit fraud, child endangerment, money laundering, and attempted obstruction of justice. Her plea negotiations had failed when investigators determined that her claims about larger criminal networks were fabricated attempts to reduce her sentence. The defendant showed a complete disregard for the safety and well-being of children. Quote, Judge Williams had stated during sentencing. Her crimes were not impulsive mistakes, but calculated acts of predation designed to exploit the most vulnerable members of our society. The evidence shows a pattern of deliberate harm followed by systematic efforts to silence victims and escape accountability. Jake stood beside me, holding Nathan, who had grown into a healthy, energetic 18-month-old with no lasting effects from Victoria's attempt to poison him. Our son babbled happily, completely unaware that the woman being sentenced had tried to kill him for no reason other than her own twisted psychology. The courtroom had been packed with Victoria's victims and their families, many of whom had traveled hundreds of miles to witness her sentencing. Patricia Williams, whose daughter had suffered severe allergic reactions, sat in the front row with tears streaming down her face. Sandra Chen, whose son had been hospitalized after eating contaminated food, held her now healthy child while watching justice finally being served. But perhaps the most powerful testimony had come from Dr. Maria Santos, the pediatrician who had treated Nathan during his hospitalization. She'd explained to the court how Victoria's pattern of endangering children represented a form of terrorism, specifically targeting families and medical professionals who tried to protect them. The defendant's actions weren't just criminal, Dr. Santos had testified. They were designed to create fear and uncertainty in parents about their ability to protect their children, and in medical professionals about our ability to provide accurate diagnoses and treatment. This is psychological warfare against the fundamental bonds that hold families and communities together. The federal investigation had ultimately revealed that Victoria had been responsible for harming over 30 children across a 4-year period. Her method had been to identify families with young children, research their specific vulnerabilities, and then create situations where those vulnerabilities could be exploited for her financial benefit. The psychological evaluation conducted during her trial had diagnosed Victoria with antisocial personality disorder and narcissistic traits that made her incapable of genuine empathy or remorse. Mental health experts testified that she viewed other people, including children, as objects to be manipulated for her own benefit rather than as human beings deserving of care and protection. The defendant demonstrates a complete inability to form genuine emotional connections with others. Dr. Rebecca Martinez, the court-appointed psychiatrist, had explained. Her relationships are entirely transactional. based on what she can extract from other people rather than any genuine care or affection. This makes her extremely dangerous to continue operating in society. The financial restitution ordered by the court totaled over $800,000, money that would be distributed among Victoria's victims to cover medical expenses, therapy costs, and punitive damages. Her assets, including the offshore accounts she'd planned to use for her escape, had been seized and liquidated to fund the restitution payments. But the most satisfying aspect of Victoria's sentencing was that she'd received no support from anyone during the trial. Our parents had testified against her, describing how she'd manipulated and stolen from them while using their money to pay off the families of children she'd harmed. Her former friends and business associates had provided evidence of her fraudulent activities rather than character references. Even her attorney had abandoned her case after being arrested for conspiracy, leaving Victoria to face sentencing with a court-appointed public defender who had advised her to accept responsibility and show remorse. She'd refused, maintaining her innocence and blaming everyone else for her situation, right up until the final gavel fell. As we left the courthouse, I reflected on how completely Victoria's life had collapsed as a result of her decision to poison Nathan. The woman who had been obsessed with social media fame and carefully curated success was now facing decades in federal prison with no possibility of parole. Her business was destroyed, her reputation ruined, and her family relationships permanently severed. The irony wasn't lost on me that Victoria's downfall had begun with her attempt to control a family gathering by feeding my son something she knew I'd forbidden. Her need to assert dominance over my parental decisions had ultimately led to her losing her freedom permanently. Jake's response had been everything I could have hoped for in a partner and father. He'd protected our family with the same strategic thinking and comprehensive planning that made him successful in military operations. Rather than engaging in emotional retaliation, he'd systematically gathered evidence and applied appropriate legal pressure until Victoria was neutralized as a threat. She made the mistake of thinking she was dealing with civilians who would back down when threatened. Jake observed as we drove home from the courthouse. She had no idea that attacking my family would trigger the full resources of the federal government. The case had also prompted significant changes in how event planning and childcare businesses were regulated. New federal guidelines required background checks, safety certifications, and insurance requirements for anyone providing services to families with young children. Victoria's crimes had made it much harder for other predators to exploit children through seemingly legitimate business relationships. More importantly, the case had established legal precedents for protecting military families from targeted harassment and intimidation. The Department of Defense had implemented new protocols for investigating threats against personnel and their dependents, using Victoria's case as a model for how civilian crimes could escalate into national security concerns. Nathan's medical records remained sealed under federal protection, ensuring that no one could ever again question the diagnosis or treatment he'd received. The attempt to poison him was now officially classified as an act of domestic terrorism, giving his case the highest possible level of legal protection. Our family had emerged from the ordeal stronger and more united than ever. The crisis had revealed the true character of everyone involved, separating those who would protect a child from those who would enable his abuser. Jake's parents had flown in from Oklahoma to support us during the trial, forming closer bonds with Nathan and offering to help with child care, while Jake completed his current deployment. My parents had also transformed their relationship with us, finally understanding that their previous favoritism toward Victoria had enabled her criminal behavior. They'd sold their house in Winston-Salem and moved closer to us, wanting to be actively involved in Nathan's life while making amends for their role in defending his abuser. "We should have listened to your concerns about Victoria years ago," my father had admitted during one of our weekly dinners. "We were so invested in believing that she was successful and responsible that we ignored obvious signs of dangerous behavior. We failed you and Nathan, and we're committed to doing better." The family dynamic had completely reversed from the toxic pattern that had existed before Nathan's poisoning. Instead of being the overlooked daughter whose concerns were dismissed, I was now recognized as the parent who had tried to protect her child from a dangerous relative. My instincts about Victoria's behavior had been vindicated completely, and my judgment was now trusted and respected. Jake had also received recognition within military circles for his handling of a domestic threat that had national security implications. His ability to identify and neutralize Victoria's criminal activities before they could expand into targeting other military families had earned him commendations and opportunities for advancement within special operations. But the most meaningful recognition came from the families of Victoria's other victims, who had thanked us for having the courage to fight her manipulation and expose her crimes. Our willingness to pursue justice for Nathan had given other families permission to speak about their own experiences and seek accountability for the harm Victoria had caused their children. Patricia Williams had become a close friend, bonding with me over our shared experience of having children targeted by Victoria's calculated cruelty. Her daughter had recovered completely from the allergic reactions Victoria had deliberately triggered, and Patricia had become an advocate for stronger regulation of businesses that serve children. Your family's fight gave the rest of us hope that justice was possible, Patricia had told me after Victoria's sentencing. If you'd accepted her manipulation and stayed silent, she would have continued hurting children indefinitely. Nathan's case saved other families from going through what we experienced. The financial restitution from Victoria's seized assets had allowed us to establish a college fund for Nathan that would ensure his future education was fully funded. The money felt appropriate, since Victoria's attempt to harm him had ultimately provided for his long-term well-being through her forfeited criminal proceeds. We'd also used some of the restitution money to create a foundation providing support for families whose children had been victims of predatory businesses. The Nathan Reynolds Foundation offered legal assistance, counseling services, and financial support for medical expenses related to crimes against children. Jake had insisted that the foundation maintain a low profile to protect Nathan's privacy as he grew up, but the organization had already helped dozens of families navigate the legal system and recover from crimes similar to Victoria's. It felt meaningful to transform Nathan's suffering into something that could prevent other children from experiencing similar harm. As Nathan approached his second birthday, I sometimes wondered what kind of person Victoria might have become if she'd chosen accountability over manipulation when her criminal behavior was first exposed. The psychiatric evaluations suggested that her personality disorders made genuine change unlikely, but I still felt sadness for the waste of human potential her choices represented. The sister I'd grown up with had never really existed. The Victoria I'd known had been a carefully constructed facade designed to hide a predator who targeted children for financial gain. The woman who went to federal prison was the real Victoria, someone whose cruelty and manipulation had been masked by social media success and family enablement. But I'd learned important lessons about trust, boundaries, and the difference between family loyalty and family enablement. Real love sometimes meant setting firm boundaries and holding people accountable for harmful behavior, even when those people were family members. Jake's military training had taught him that threats should be met with overwhelming force, designed to neutralize danger permanently, rather than temporary solutions that allowed problems to escalate. His approach to Victoria had been clinical, comprehensive, and ultimately successful in protecting our family from further harm. The woman who had tried to poison my son on his first birthday was now spending her remaining productive years in federal prison, where she couldn't harm any more children. Her carefully curated social media empire had been replaced by a prison number, and her dreams of business success had been replaced by the reality of permanent incarceration. Nathan would grow up knowing that his parents had fought for him when he couldn't fight for himself, that they'd refused to accept anyone's attempt to harm him, regardless of family pressure or social expectations. He'd learn that real strength sometimes meant making difficult choices to protect the people you love. Victoria's attempt to assert control over our family gathering had ultimately cost her everything she'd claimed to value. Her freedom, her reputation, her relationships, and her future had all been forfeited because she couldn't accept a simple boundary about not giving honey to a baby. The consequences were permanent, severe, and entirely self-inflicted. She'd chosen escalation over accountability at every opportunity, transforming a family dispute into a federal terrorism case through her own desperate attempts to avoid responsibility. As I watched Nathan play in our backyard, healthy and happy, and completely unaware of the war that had been fought over his safety, I felt grateful for Jake's systematic approach to protecting our family. Victoria had learned too late, that threatening a Delta Force commander's child brought consequences she was entirely unprepared to handle. The life poisoning she'd received in return for poisoning Nathan was exactly what she'd earned through her own choices and actions. Justice had been served completely, and our family was finally safe from her manipulation and cruelty. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.